Hey there, friend. Welcome to this quiet corner of history, where we gently unwrap the layers of ancient times. Tonight, we're stepping into a world that might feel both familiar and startlingly foreign, the world of biblical women, where life moved to rhythms we can barely imagine today. Whether you're settling in for the night or just looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you've joined me here. I'd love to know where you're listening from, what city, what country, and what time it is as you press play. There's something deeply comforting about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, yet connected by these ancient stories that still echo through time. If this kind of gentle historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more journeys through the quiet corridors of the past ahead of us. Now, let's talk about something that might surprise you. We live in 2025, an era where a woman can wake up, check her phone for messages, grab coffee on her way to run a multinational corporation, vote for a president, divorce a husband if she chooses, own property in 12 countries, and adopt children as a single parent, all before lunch. But imagine if every single one of those actions was not just unusual, but impossible. Imagine if your gender determined not just your opportunities, but your very right to speak, to choose, to exist as an individual. That was the reality for women in biblical times. And here's what's fascinating. Many of the restrictions that shaped their lives weren't just cultural preferences or temporary customs. They were woven so deeply into the fabric of ancient society that they seemed as natural and unchangeable as sunrise and sunset. These weren't necessarily cruel people making cruel choices. They were people living within systems that had evolved over thousands of years, systems that to them felt as normal and necessary as our modern freedoms feel to us. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's walk together through the dusty streets of ancient Jerusalem, Babylon, and the nomadic camps of Abraham's time. Let's meet women whose names echo through eternity: Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Ruth, Esther, and countless others whose names were never recorded, but whose lives tell a story of resilience, faith, and quiet strength in a world that offered them little room to breathe. Tonight, we begin with the most fundamental reality that shaped every aspect of a biblical woman's existence. She belonged to someone else, always. From birth until death, she was never simply herself. In our modern world, we take for granted the concept of individual identity. You are you, with your own social security number, your own credit score, your own Netflix password. You can sign contracts, make medical decisions, choose where to live, what to eat, whom to marry, whether to have children. These choices belong to you, and while family and society might influence your decisions, the final authority rests in your hands. But in biblical times, a woman existed in a perpetual state of what we might call legal invisibility. She began life under the absolute authority of her father. When she married, that authority transferred completely to her husband. If she became widowed, it might pass to her eldest son, or she might return to her father's household if he was still alive. She was never, at any point in her life, considered a fully autonomous legal entity. This wasn't just a matter of paperwork or social custom. This was survival. In a world without social safety nets, without women's shelters, without employment opportunities for females, without police protection, without courts that recognize women's testimony as equal to men's, a woman alone was a woman in mortal danger. The system of male guardianship wasn't just about control, though control it certainly was. It was also about protection in a world that could be lethally hostile to the unprotected. Think about Sarah, wife of Abraham. Here was a woman who traveled thousands of miles, left her homeland, endured decades of childlessness, and played a crucial role in the founding of a nation. Yet when famine struck and Abraham feared for their safety, he twice asked her to pose as his sister rather than his wife, calculating that foreign kings might kill him to take her if they knew she was married, but might simply take her if they thought she was available. Sarah had no say in this deception. Her safety, her dignity, her very body were bargaining chips in Abraham's survival strategy. The text records no protest from her, no consultation with her, no consideration of her feelings about being handed over to strange men's harems. This wasn't because Abraham was particularly callous, or because Sarah was particularly submissive. This was simply how the world worked. A woman's preferences were not just secondary to a man's decisions, they were irrelevant to them. Compare this to today, where the very suggestion that a husband might make such a decision for his wife would be met with outrage, legal consequences, and probably a trending hashtag. We live in a world where married couples negotiate everything from vacation destinations to retirement plans, where "my body, my choice" is a rallying cry heard round the world, where the concept of informed consent shapes everything from medical procedures to employment contracts. But biblical women lived in a world where consent was not a concept that applied to them. Marriage was not a partnership between equals, but a transaction between families. Love might grow within marriage, as it clearly did between Isaac and Rebekah, between Jacob and Rachel. But love was not the foundation upon which marriages were built. Security, alliance, economic advantage, and the continuation of family lines were the considerations that mattered. Rebekah's story illustrates this perfectly. When Abraham's servant arrived at her family's well, seeking a wife for Isaac, Rebekah showed kindness, hospitality, and initiative. She drew water not just for the servant but for all his camels, a backbreaking task that revealed her character. But when it came time to decide whether she would marry Isaac, whether she would leave her family forever and travel to a foreign land to marry a man she had never met, the negotiation took place entirely between the servant and her male relatives, her father, her brother. They discussed bride price. They weighed the advantages. They made the decision. To their credit, they did ask Rebekah if she was willing to go, a courtesy not always extended in such arrangements. But notice what they asked. Not whether she wanted to marry Isaac, not whether she felt called to this union, not whether she loved him or felt compatible with him. They asked only whether she was willing to go. And in a world where a woman's alternatives to marriage were poverty, social ostracism, or becoming a burden on her family, willingness carried a different weight than it does today. Today we might swipe left or right on dating apps, meet for coffee, endure awkward small talk, navigate the complex dance of modern courtship. We might live together, break up, try again, attend couples therapy, negotiate prenups. We expect partnership, communication, mutual respect. We expect love to be a choice made freely by two equal parties. Biblical women expected survival. And if affection grew from that survival, if respect developed, if love bloomed in the soil of duty and circumstance, that was a gift from God, but it was never guaranteed, and it was certainly never required. This fundamental difference in expectation shaped everything else about their lives. When we read that Sarah laughed when God promised she would bear a child in her old age, we're not just hearing the response of a woman who had given up hope of motherhood. We're hearing the response of a woman who understood that her primary value lay in her ability to produce heirs, who had lived with the daily knowledge that her failure to conceive reflected not just personal disappointment, but social failure, economic insecurity, and religious inadequacy. In our modern world, childlessness might be a source of personal grief, but it's not typically a source of social shame or economic disaster. Women today might choose career over family, might struggle with infertility, and find fulfillment in adoption, might remain single by choice, and build rich, meaningful lives. But Sarah lived in a world where a childless woman was not just unfortunate. She was incomplete, unsuccessful, possibly cursed by God. The pressure was crushing. Every month that passed without conception was another month of failure. Every sideways glance from neighbors was a reminder of inadequacy. Every younger woman who announced a pregnancy was a living rebuke to Sarah's barrenness. And when Sarah finally did conceive Isaac at the age of 90, her first recorded words were not of joy or gratitude, but of defensive justification. God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Even in her triumph, Sarah expected judgment. Even in her miracle, she prepared for mockery. This was the psychological landscape in which biblical women lived, a landscape where every aspect of their identity was measured against their ability to fulfill roles they had not chosen but could not escape. And yet, within these crushing constraints, we see something remarkable. We see women who found ways to exercise agency, to influence outcomes, to protect their children and secure their futures. Sarah may have had to endure Abraham's deceptions, but she also successfully demanded that he banish Hagar and Ishmael to protect Isaac's inheritance. Rebekah may have been given in marriage to a stranger, but she later orchestrated an elaborate deception to ensure that the blessing intended for Esau went to Jacob instead. These women learned to work within systems that constrained them, to find power in the shadows, to influence through indirection what they could not control through direct action. They became experts at reading the unstated rules, at understanding the unspoken dynamics that governed their world. In our modern context, we might call such behavior manipulative. We might criticize Rebekah for deceiving Isaac, or judge Sarah for her treatment of Hagar. But these judgments come from our position of privilege, from our world where women have direct access to power, where manipulation is unnecessary because straightforward advocacy is possible. Biblical women lived in a world where indirect influence was often the only influence available to them. They learned to navigate systems of power from positions of powerlessness to achieve their goals through the men who held legal authority over them. This wasn't weakness. This was survival strategy elevated to an art form. Consider Esther, perhaps the most politically powerful woman in the Hebrew Bible. Even she, as queen of the Persian Empire, could not simply walk into the king's presence to discuss the threat facing her people. She had to wait to be summoned, had to risk death by approaching without invitation, had to use beauty and banquets and carefully orchestrated dramatic revelations to achieve what a male advisor might have accomplished with a straightforward meeting. The very fact that Esther's story is preserved and celebrated tells us something important about how these ancient societies understood women's power. It was real, it was significant, it could change the course of history, but it was always exercised within constraints that would be unimaginable to us today. As we continue our journey through the lives of biblical women, we'll explore how these fundamental realities, the absence of legal autonomy, the primacy of male authority, the pressure to fulfill predetermined roles, shaped every aspect of their existence. We'll see how they navigated marriage and motherhood, how they found meaning within constraints, how they exercised faith in a religious system that often seemed designed to exclude them. We'll meet women who were praised for their obedience and women who were celebrated for their defiance, women who found safety in conformity and women who found purpose in resistance. We'll discover that the story of biblical women is not simply a story of oppression, though oppression was certainly part of it, but a more complex narrative of human resilience, of finding light in dark places, of creating meaning within systems that sought to limit it. Tonight, we've only begun to scratch the surface of this ancient world, this place where a woman's life was measured not by her own dreams and choices, but by her ability to fulfill the expectations of others. In the quiet hours ahead, we'll delve deeper into the daily realities that shape these women's lives, the customs and laws and beliefs that constrained them, and the remarkable ways they found to transcend those constraints. But for now, let yourself settle into the rhythm of this ancient world. Let your breathing slow as you imagine the oil lamps flickering in desert tents, the sound of grinding grain in pre-dawn darkness, the whispered prayers of women whose names were known to God even when they were forgotten by history. These women lived and loved and struggled and endured in a world so different from ours that it might as well have been another planet. And yet, in their humanity, in their longing for safety and love and meaning, in their quiet acts of courage and their moments of doubt and their flashes of joy, they are recognizably us. Across the centuries, across the vast differences in law and custom and possibility, we recognize in them the same hopes and fears that drive us today. The restrictions that shaped their lives may seem harsh to us, even cruel, but they were also the reality within which these remarkable women found ways to love, to influence, to matter. They were the framework within which some of history's most enduring stories of faith and courage unfolded. As we drift deeper into this ancient world, let's pause at the doorway of a typical household in biblical times. Picture, if you will, the moment when dawn breaks over the hills of Judea. In our modern world, that dawn might greet a woman checking her phone, brewing coffee, perhaps video calling colleagues in different time zones before her children wake. But in biblical times, dawn greeted women who had been awake for hours already, grinding grain by lamplight, kneading dough, stoking fires that had been banked through the night. The biblical woman's day began not with choices, but with obligations carved in stone by centuries of tradition. While her husband might spend his morning discussing business with other men at the city gate, or tending flocks in distant pastures, or studying Torah with learned elders, she moved through a choreography of tasks that had been performed by her mother, her grandmother, and her great-grandmother in precisely the same way. This wasn't simply about different gender roles, though the roles were certainly different. This was about a fundamental difference in how time itself was understood and experienced. Modern women might complain about work-life balance, about juggling careers and families, about the pressure to have it all. But these complaints, valid as they are, emerge from a world where we have choices to juggle. Biblical women lived in a world where the very concept of choice was foreign. Consider the simple act of going to market. Today, a woman might decide to stop at the grocery store on her way home from work, might choose between organic and conventional produce, might use a credit card in her own name, might select items based on her personal preferences or dietary restrictions. The entire transaction is an expression of individual agency, what she wants, what she can afford, what she chooses to prioritize. But a biblical woman's relationship to the marketplace was entirely different. First, she might not go to market at all. That privilege might belong to her husband or sons. If she did go, she carried money that was not legally hers, made purchases based on household needs that she did not define, and negotiated prices according to standards set by men who could override her decisions at any moment. More importantly, her very presence in the marketplace was governed by rules that we would find suffocating. She would need to be accompanied by a male relative or servant. Her interactions with merchants would be formal, limited, carefully observed. She would cover her hair, modulate her voice, avoid direct eye contact with men outside her family. Every gesture, every word, every moment of her public existence was choreographed according to codes designed to preserve not just her reputation, but her family's honor. This brings us to perhaps the most foreign concept of all for modern women. The idea that your individual actions could bring shame or honor not just to yourself, but to an entire extended network of relatives, living and dead. Today, we might embarrass ourselves, make poor choices, even fail spectacularly, but we generally understand these consequences as personal. Our mistakes are our own. Our successes belong to us. Our reputations are individual possessions. Biblical women carried the weight of collective responsibility. A daughter's behavior reflected on her father's wisdom and authority. A wife's actions could enhance or diminish her husband's standing in the community. A mother's failures could impact her children's marriage prospects for generations. This wasn't paranoia or social anxiety. This was the actual structure of ancient society, where individual identity was meaningless outside the context of family, clan, and tribal affiliation. The story of Tamar, daughter-in-law of Judah, illustrates this crushing weight of collective responsibility. When her first husband died childless, she married his brother according to the custom of levirate marriage, a practice designed to ensure that family lines continued and that widows received protection. When the second husband also died childless, she was promised to Judah's youngest son, but Judah, perhaps fearing that she was cursed, delayed the marriage indefinitely. Here was a woman caught in an impossible situation. She could not remarry outside the family without Judah's permission. She could not support herself independently. She could not even return to her father's house without bringing shame on both families. So she waited, trapped in a legal limbo that modern women would find intolerable. We might ask, why didn't she demand her rights? Why didn't she seek other options? Why didn't she simply leave? But these questions reveal how thoroughly our modern perspective shapes our understanding. Tamar had no rights to demand, no other options to seek, nowhere to go that would not result in destitution or death. Her only power lay in understanding the system well enough to manipulate it, which is exactly what she did. Disguising herself as a prostitute, she seduced Judah himself, became pregnant, and when he prepared to have her burned for adultery, she revealed that he was the father. Her manipulation of the situation secured her place in the family line and ultimately in the genealogy of King David. Modern readers might be horrified by the deception, the sexual transaction, the public humiliation. But Tamar understood something that we struggle to grasp. In a world where women had no direct power, indirect power became a matter of survival. Her actions, shocking as they seem to us, were actually a masterclass in navigating systems designed to exclude her. This difference in available power, direct versus indirect, shaped not just individual actions, but entire patterns of female behavior in biblical times. Women became experts at reading the unspoken, at understanding the subtle dynamics that governed their world, at achieving their goals through influence rather than authority. Take Bathsheba, whose story is often reduced to a simple narrative of seduction and adultery. But look more closely at how she navigated her impossible situation. When King David summoned her, she had no choice but to comply. Refusing a king's command was not an option available to her. When she became pregnant, she informed David, placing the responsibility squarely on his shoulders. When her husband Uriah was killed in battle on David's orders, she mourned appropriately and then married the king, as custom required. But the story doesn't end there. Years later, when David was dying and his son Adonijah was positioning himself to inherit the throne, Bathsheba orchestrated a careful campaign to ensure that her son Solomon would be chosen instead. Working through the prophet Nathan, timing her approach precisely, using her knowledge of David's promises and his desire to honor them, she secured the succession for Solomon and consequently, safety for herself. This wasn't manipulation for its own sake. This was strategic thinking, born of necessity. Bathsheba understood that in a world where a king's death could mean disaster for his wives and children, where political transitions often involved the elimination of potential rivals, her son's claim to the throne was literally a matter of life and death for her family. Compare this to our modern world, where women can run for office themselves, where they can build independent careers, where they can accumulate wealth and power in their own names. We might still face gender discrimination, still encounter glass ceilings, still struggle with work-life balance, but we have direct access to the levers of power in ways that would have been unimaginable to biblical women. Yet even as we recognize these vast differences, we can't help but admire the skill with which biblical women navigated their constraints. They developed what we might call shadow leadership, the ability to influence outcomes without official authority, to shape decisions without making them directly, to protect their interests through careful alliance building and strategic thinking. This shadow leadership was not just a personal survival strategy, it was often the mechanism through which God's purposes were accomplished in biblical narratives. Rebekah's deception ensured that Jacob, not Esau, received Isaac's blessing. Rahab's protection of the Israelite spies enabled the conquest of Jericho. Esther's careful manipulation of court politics saved the Jewish people from genocide. Time and again, the biblical narrative suggests that women's indirect power was not a consolation prize, but an essential element in the unfolding of divine plans. Their ability to work within systems, to influence from the margins, to achieve crucial outcomes without official recognition, was not just remarkable, it was necessary. As we settle deeper into the quiet rhythm of this ancient world, consider how different your day would be if you woke tomorrow into the life of a biblical woman. Your first thoughts would not be about your own goals, your own schedule, your own choices, but about the needs and expectations of others. Your husband's comfort, your children's welfare, your household's requirements, your family's reputation. These would be the coordinates by which you navigated every moment. You would speak when spoken to, go where permitted, express opinions when asked, always within the boundaries of what was considered appropriate for your station. You would find your identity not in your individual achievements, but in your relationships, daughter of, wife of, mother of. Your legacy would be measured not by what you accomplished, but by how well you fulfilled the roles assigned to you. And yet, within these constraints, you might also discover reserves of strength you never knew you possessed. You might develop skills of observation and influence that our more direct modern approach never requires. You might find ways to matter, to make a difference, to leave a mark on the world that would echo through generations. The biblical women whose stories we're exploring were not weak or passive victims of their circumstances. They were strategists, survivors, and often heroes, working within systems that limited them but never quite managing to contain them entirely. Their stories remind us that human dignity and divine purpose can flourish even in the most restrictive circumstances, that influence can be exercised from positions of apparent powerlessness, and that sometimes the most important victories are won not through direct confrontation, but through patient, careful, strategic persistence. As the night deepens and these ancient voices whisper across the centuries, let yourself feel the weight of their world, not to judge it by our standards, but to understand it on its own terms. These were women who lived and loved and struggled within constraints we can barely imagine, yet who found ways to be fully human, fully faithful, fully themselves, despite everything that sought to diminish them. Their strength was different from ours, their power exercised differently, their voices heard through different channels, but strength it was, power it was, and their voices still echo, carrying across the millennia lessons about resilience, about finding light in dark places, about the mysterious ways that divine purposes unfold through human lives, even when those lives seem most constrained by earthly limitations. The soft glow of oil lamps illuminates another aspect of biblical women's lives that would seem utterly foreign to us today: their relationship with their own bodies, their health, their very physical existence. In 2025, a woman might track her menstrual cycle on an app, schedule a gynecological appointment, discuss birth control options with her doctor, or make informed decisions about pregnancy and childbirth with access to medical knowledge accumulated over centuries. But biblical women lived in a world where their bodies were mysteries even to themselves, where natural biological processes were wrapped in layers of religious law, social taboo, and medical ignorance. Consider something as fundamental as menstruation. Today, we might complain about the inconvenience, the discomfort, the expense of feminine hygiene products. We might advocate for menstrual equity, for workplace accommodations, for better healthcare coverage. But our complaints and advocacy emerge from a framework where menstruation is understood as a normal biological function, where we have access to products that make it manageable, where we can continue our daily lives largely uninterrupted. Biblical women faced a completely different reality. According to Levitical law, a menstruating woman was considered ritually unclean for 7 days. During this time, she could not enter the temple, could not touch holy objects, could not prepare certain foods. Anyone or anything she touched became unclean as well. Her husband could not approach her. Her children might avoid her. Her very presence could disrupt the spiritual cleanliness of her household. This wasn't merely inconvenient, it was isolating in ways that modern women struggle to comprehend. Imagine being banished from your own kitchen, your own bedroom, your own family's embrace, simply because your body was functioning as God had designed it to function. Imagine the psychological impact of being told, month after month, that your most fundamental biological processes rendered you spiritually contaminated. Yet here's what's remarkable. Rather than seeing these restrictions as purely oppressive, many biblical women found ways to reclaim these periods of separation. The time of Niddah, as it was known, became a time for rest, for reflection, for connection with other women. In households where women worked from dawn until dusk, where their labor never ceased, these mandatory periods of separation might have been the only respite they ever received. Some scholars suggest that these laws, harsh as they seem to us, may actually have protected women's health in a world without modern medical understanding. The enforced rest during menstruation and childbirth, the temporary relief from sexual obligations, the communal support from other women during these times, perhaps these restrictions serve protective functions that we can only appreciate in retrospect. But the isolation extended far beyond menstruation. Childbirth, that moment we now celebrate with baby showers and hospital visitors and social media announcements, rendered a biblical woman unclean for weeks. After the birth of a son, she was considered unclean for 7 days, then required an additional 33 days of purification. After the birth of a daughter, these periods doubled, 2 weeks of uncleanness, then 66 days of purification. The message was clear. Female bodies, female biological functions, even female offspring, carried a spiritual contamination that required extensive ritual cleansing. A woman who had just performed the miracle of bringing new life into the world was treated as spiritually defiled by the very act that made her most godlike in her creative power. Compare this to our modern celebration of motherhood, where we might have gender reveal parties, maternity photo shoots, baby naming ceremonies, where we understand pregnancy and childbirth as natural, beautiful processes, deserving of medical support and social celebration, where a new mother might return to work with pumping brakes legally protected, where she might receive congratulations, gifts, and support from her community. Biblical women experienced motherhood through a lens of contamination and purification, of joy shadowed by shame, of natural processes made shameful by religious interpretation. Yet they persisted. They bore children. They found ways to celebrate and bond and love despite the framework of contamination that surrounded their most fundamental experiences. The restrictions on women's bodies extended to their voices as well. In our world, women serve as news anchors, politicians, teachers, preachers, singers, public speakers. We might still encounter discrimination, might still struggle to be heard in male-dominated spaces, but the basic right to speak publicly is not questioned. We have podcasts and YouTube channels. We write books and articles. We testify in courts and legislatures. Biblical women lived under the Apostle Paul's instruction that women should remain silent in church, should not teach or have authority over men, should learn in quietness and submission. This wasn't just about religious services. In a world where religious law governed civil law, where community life centered around synagogue and temple, where spiritual authority translated directly into social power, these restrictions on women's voices effectively silenced them from public discourse entirely. Yet even here, we see the remarkable adaptability of women finding ways to be heard despite the constraints. Miriam led the Israelite women in song and dance after crossing the Red Sea. Deborah served as both prophet and judge, holding court under her palm tree and leading Israel into battle. Huldah the prophetess was consulted by kings and priests when the Book of the Law was discovered in the temple. These women found ways to exercise spiritual authority even within systems designed to exclude them. They became prophets when prophecy was one of the few spiritual roles available to women. They influenced through their husbands, their sons, their careful positioning within the informal networks that actually governed daily life. They discovered that divine calling could sometimes override human restrictions, that God's voice could speak through female lips even when human authorities preferred those lips to remain silent. The economic constraints facing biblical women were perhaps even more restrictive than the spiritual ones. Today, women might face wage gaps, glass ceilings, discrimination in hiring and promotion. These are serious problems that deserve our continued attention and activism. But they are problems that exist within a framework where women's right to work, to own property, to control their own finances is legally recognized and socially accepted. Biblical women had no such framework. They could not own property independently, could not enter into business contracts, could not inherit equally with their brothers, could not provide for themselves if left without male protection. Their economic security depended entirely on their relationships with men, fathers, husbands, sons, who might be kind or cruel, responsible or reckless, present or absent. The story of Ruth illustrates both the vulnerability and the resourcefulness of women in this economic system. When her husband died, leaving her childless, she faced a choice: return to her father's house in Moab and hope for remarriage, or accompany her mother-in-law Naomi back to Bethlehem and face an uncertain future as a foreign widow in a strange land. She chose loyalty over security, accompanying Naomi into economic precariousness. But Ruth didn't simply accept destitution. She learned about gleaning rights, the provision in Israelite law that allowed the poor to gather grain left behind by harvesters. She positioned herself strategically in the fields of Boaz, a kinsman who might have obligations to her family. She followed Naomi's careful instructions for approaching Boaz at the threshing floor, essentially proposing marriage in a way that honored both custom and her own dignity. Ruth's story is often romanticized as a simple tale of love and loyalty, but underneath the romance lies a masterclass in economic survival strategy. Ruth understood the system well enough to navigate it successfully, moving from vulnerable widow to protected wife to honored ancestor of King David. She worked within constraints that would be unthinkable to modern women, yet she achieved security and significance through her careful understanding of the possibilities available to her. This pattern repeats throughout biblical narratives. Women finding ways to secure their economic futures despite having no direct access to economic power. Abigail, married to the churlish Nabal, managed her household's resources so skillfully that when David demanded provisions from her husband, she was able to provide them herself, probably saving her entire household from destruction. When Nabal died shortly after, David married her, recognizing her wisdom and capability. The widow of Zarephath, facing starvation during a severe drought, shared her last meal with the prophet Elijah and found her oil and flour miraculously sustained throughout the famine. Her act of faith became an economic investment that saved her and her sons' lives. Even in the most desperate circumstances, biblical women found ways to make choices that mattered, to exercise agency within systems that seemed designed to render them powerless. These economic strategies required skills that modern women rarely need to develop. Biblical women became experts at reading social dynamics, at understanding the unspoken rules that governed their world, at building relationships that could provide security when formal economic structures failed them. They learned to recognize opportunity in situations that might appear hopeless, to turn constraints into possibilities, to find power in apparent powerlessness. But perhaps the most significant difference between biblical women and modern women lies in their relationship to time itself. We live in a world of schedules and deadlines, of career planning and retirement savings, of goals and achievements mapped across decades. We might complain that time moves too fast, that we're too busy, that we need better work-life balance, but our complaints assume that time belongs to us, that we have the right to choose how to spend it, that our lives are narratives we write ourselves. Biblical women lived in cyclical time, in seasonal time, in time that belonged not to them but to the rhythms of agricultural life, of religious observance, of family obligation. Their days were measured not by personal accomplishments, but by the needs of others. Their years were marked not by career milestones, but by pregnancies, by children's growth, by the aging of husbands and parents whose care became their responsibility. This different relationship to time created a different kind of life entirely. Modern women might struggle with the question of having it all, balancing career ambitions with family desires, managing multiple roles and responsibilities. But this struggle assumes choice, assumes that we have various possibilities to balance. Biblical women lived in a world where their time was not their own to balance, where their possibilities were predetermined by their gender, their family status, their social position. Yet, within these constraints, they created meaning. They found purpose in the care of others, significance in the preservation of family lines, legacy in the children they raised, and the traditions they passed down. They developed forms of creativity and influence that worked within their limitations rather than against them. As we drift deeper into this ancient world, let the weight of these constraints settle around you, like the heavy robes these women wore. Feel the texture of a life lived entirely for others, where personal desires were not just secondary, but often incomprehensible. Imagine waking each day not to your own agenda, but to a choreography of obligations written by centuries of tradition. Yet in that weight, in that constraint, notice also the strength that developed. Like trees that grow more robust in windy places, biblical women developed reserves of resilience, creativity, and influence that flourished precisely because they had to work within such limitations. Their stories remind us that human dignity doesn't require perfect freedom, that meaning can be found in the most constrained circumstances, that love and purpose and even joy can bloom in ground that seems too hard to sustain them. The night is deep now, and these ancient voices whisper across the centuries, carrying stories of women who lived and loved and endured within systems we can barely comprehend. Their strength was different from ours, their victories measured by different standards, their legacy preserved in ways that honored their world, even as it limited their possibilities. In the gentle darkness, let their resilience become a lullaby, their quiet courage a blessing, their enduring faith a soft pillow for your own rest. The morning light filters through the narrow window of a house in ancient Jerusalem, and we find ourselves observing a scene that would be utterly foreign to a woman in 2025. Here, a young woman named Miriam sits quietly in the corner, while her father negotiates her future with a stranger. She keeps her eyes downcast, her hands folded, her voice silent. This isn't shyness or social anxiety. This is survival. This is how a woman preserved her reputation, her family's honor, and her own safety in a world that punished female assertiveness with social death. In our modern world, we might critique this scene as oppressive, might wonder why Miriam doesn't speak up, doesn't advocate for herself, doesn't demand a voice in decisions that will shape her entire life. But to judge biblical women by modern standards is to miss the profound courage it took simply to exist within the systems that constrained them. Let's step closer to Miriam's world. She has been raised from infancy to understand that her primary value lies not in her thoughts, her creativity, her intelligence, or her dreams, but in her ability to bring honor to her family through proper behavior. Every gesture has been taught, every response practiced, every expression carefully moderated. She has learned to walk quietly, speak softly, keep her opinions to herself, and find fulfillment in the reflection of others' satisfaction with her conduct. This training began before she could walk. While modern toddlers might be encouraged to explore, to question, to express their personalities freely, biblical girls were shaped from their earliest moments to understand that their role was to serve, to support, to remain in the background. They learned to grind grain before they learned to read, if they learned to read at all. They mastered the arts of bread making, water carrying, and child minding, while their brothers studied Torah, learned trades, and prepared for public life. The psychological impact of such early conditioning is difficult for us to comprehend. Imagine never being asked what you want, only what you can provide. Imagine being praised not for your achievements, but for your compliance. Imagine growing up in a world where your highest aspiration is to become so perfectly invisible that no one ever has cause to criticize your behavior. Yet within this invisibility, biblical women developed their own forms of communication, their own networks of influence, their own ways of mattering. They spoke through glances across rooms, through the placement of objects, through the timing of meals. They influenced through their sons, guided through their careful management of household resources, and shaped outcomes through their deep understanding of the men who held official power over them. Consider the daily reality of marriage for these women. Today, we might struggle with communication issues, with balancing career and family, with maintaining individual identity within partnership. We attend couples therapy, read relationship books, negotiate household responsibilities. We expect marriage to be a source of personal fulfillment, emotional support, and mutual growth. But biblical marriage was an economic arrangement first, a social alliance second, and a personal relationship third, if at all. Love might develop, affection might grow, but these were bonuses rather than requirements. A biblical wife's success was measured not by her happiness, but by her husband's satisfaction, her children's welfare, and her household's smooth operation. The story of Leah illustrates this crushing reality. She was given in marriage to Jacob through her father's deception, knowing that Jacob loved her sister Rachel and had worked 7 years to earn the right to marry her. Leah spent her entire married life competing for affection that had been promised to another woman. She bore child after child, hoping that each son would finally earn her husband's love, naming them with increasingly desperate hope. Now my husband will love me. Now my husband will be attached to me. Modern readers often focus on the injustice done to Jacob, tricked into marrying the wrong woman. But consider Leah's position, married to a man who looked at her with disappointment every day, who made no secret of preferring her sister, who treated their marriage bed as an unfortunate obligation rather than a place of intimacy and connection. She lived her entire adult life knowing that her presence was a reminder of deception, that her children were consolation prizes, that her love was unwanted and unreturned. Yet Leah persevered. She found meaning in motherhood, strength in her role as the mother of the tribes of Israel, dignity in her faithful fulfillment of duties that brought her no personal joy. Her story reminds us that resilience can flourish even in the most loveless circumstances, that women can create purpose and meaning even when they are not valued for themselves. This pattern of finding significance through others rather than through personal achievement shaped every aspect of biblical women's lives. Today, we might struggle with work-life balance, might feel pulled between personal ambitions and family responsibilities. But our struggles assume that we have legitimate claims to both, that our careers matter, that our personal fulfillment is important, that we have the right to seek happiness and achievement in multiple arenas of life. Biblical women had no such assumptions to work with. Their fulfillment was expected to come entirely through the success and happiness of others. A woman's joy was supposed to derive from her husband's prosperity, her children's achievements, her household's reputation. She was not supposed to have independent goals, separate dreams, or personal ambitions that might conflict with her family's needs. The pressure of this expectation was immense. Imagine being held responsible for everyone else's happiness, while having no right to pursue your own. Imagine being expected to find complete fulfillment in roles you never chose, in relationships that were arranged for you, in circumstances you had no power to change. Yet even within these constraints, we see flashes of individual personality, moments of assertion, glimpses of women who found ways to be themselves despite everything that sought to erase their individuality. Rachel, though beloved by Jacob, showed fierce determination in her struggles with infertility, going so far as to give her servant to Jacob as a surrogate, saying, "Give me children, or I die." Her desperation speaks to a woman who wanted something so badly she was willing to risk everything to get it. Rebekah showed remarkable initiative when she chose to water Abraham's servant's camels, a gesture that required both physical strength and generous spirit. Later, she demonstrated fierce protectiveness of her son Jacob, orchestrating an elaborate deception to secure his blessing. These weren't the actions of a passive, submissive woman, but of someone who understood how to work within systems to achieve her goals. Even the constraints on women's physical movement tell us something about the different world they inhabited. Today, a woman might travel alone for business or pleasure, might explore new cities, might adventure to foreign countries with nothing more than a guidebook and a credit card. We take for granted our right to move freely through public spaces, to go where we choose when we choose. Biblical women lived under constant supervision and restriction. They could not travel alone, could not appear in public without proper covering, could not interact freely with men outside their families. Their world was small, bounded by household walls and family connections. They might live their entire lives within a radius of a few miles, knowing only the people their families knew, experiencing only the places their male relatives allowed them to visit. This physical confinement was both protective and restrictive. In a world without police protection, without legal recourse for women who were attacked or abused, without social safety nets for those who found themselves alone, the system of male guardianship provided security at the cost of freedom. Women were protected, but they were also imprisoned. They were safe, but they were also invisible. The religious restrictions added another layer of complexity to their lives. Today, women serve as ministers, rabbis, priests, and religious leaders in many traditions. We might still encounter discrimination in some religious contexts, but the basic principle that women can have direct relationships with the divine is widely accepted. Biblical women lived in a religious system where their access to the sacred was mediated through men. They could not serve as priests, could not offer sacrifices, could not study Torah formally, could not participate in many religious rituals. Their spiritual lives were largely private affairs, expressed through personal prayer, household observances, and the informal religious instruction they gave their children. Yet within these limitations, many biblical women developed profound spiritual depth. Hannah's prayer for a child became a model of faithful petition. Miriam led the women of Israel in celebration after the crossing of the Red Sea. The prophetess Anna devoted her life to prayer and fasting in the temple. These women found ways to connect with God despite religious structures that seemed designed to keep them at a distance. Their faith was often expressed through their acceptance of difficult circumstances, their trust in divine providence when human support failed, their ability to find meaning in suffering that seemed senseless. They developed what we might call faith without agency, the ability to believe in God's goodness and purpose even when they had no power to change their circumstances, no voice in the decisions that shaped their lives, no control over their own destinies. This kind of faith required tremendous psychological and spiritual strength. It's one thing to trust God when you have options, when you can make choices, when you have some control over your circumstances. It's quite another to maintain faith when you are utterly dependent on others, when your well-being rests entirely in hands that might be careless or cruel, when your only power is the power to endure. As we settle deeper into the quiet rhythms of this ancient world, let yourself feel the weight of such constrained existence. every door closed, every choice removed, every voice silenced. Yet in that silence, notice how these women learned to speak in other ways. Through their actions, their persistence, their quiet acts of rebellion and their moments of profound faith. They were not the architects of their own lives in the way modern women expect to be. They were not the authors of their own stories, the choosers of their own paths, the definers of their own success. But they were the ones who lived within the stories others wrote for them, who found ways to matter even when their mattering was not officially recognized, who influenced outcomes even when they could not control them. Their legacy comes to us not in monuments or written records, few biblical women left behind their own words, but in the stories others told about them, in the children they raised, in the quiet ways they shaped the world through their faithfulness to roles they never chose, but somehow managed to transform through their presence. The oil lamps burn lower now in these ancient homes, casting dancing shadows on walls that have witnessed countless such scenes. Women living lives of constraint and dignity, finding meaning in limitation, discovering that even the narrowest spaces can contain infinite depth of love, faith, and quiet strength. Their world was small, but their spirits were vast. Their choices were few, but their influence was profound. Their voices were often silenced, but their stories still echo across the centuries, whispering of a different kind of heroism. The heroism of endurance, of faithfulness, of finding light in the deepest shadows. Tonight, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of perhaps the most fundamental difference between biblical women and women today. Their relationship with their own bodies, their health, and their very understanding of what it meant to be female in a world governed by divine law and ancient custom. In our modern world, a woman might wake up feeling unwell and immediately have options. She can call in sick to work, schedule a doctor's appointment, research her symptoms online, consult with specialists, seek second opinions. She can make informed decisions about her healthcare, control her reproductive choices, understand her body through the lens of medical science accumulated over millennia. She owns her physical self in ways that would have been incomprehensible to women in biblical times. But step into the world of ancient Israel, into the household where young Miriam still sits in that corner, and you enter a realm where a woman's body was not her own, not legally, not practically, not spiritually. It belonged first to her father, then to her husband, ultimately to a community that saw her physical existence as a vessel for others' needs, rather than a temple of her own autonomy. The most basic biological functions that modern women manage with relative ease became sources of shame, isolation, and religious contamination in biblical times. When Miriam's monthly cycle began, she didn't simply adjust her schedule or take pain medication. She entered a state of ritual impurity that separated her from her family, her community, her very sense of belonging in the world God had created. For 7 days, she could touch no one without making them unclean. Her husband could not approach her bed. Her children learned to keep their distance. The pots she cooked in, the clothes she wore, the furniture she sat upon, all became contaminated by her presence. She was not sick, not injured, not diseased. She was simply experiencing the natural function of a healthy female body. Yet this monthly reminder of her fertility, her capacity for creation, rendered her spiritually dangerous to everyone around her. Imagine the psychological impact of this repeated message. Every month, Miriam's body told her she was unclean, untouchable, contaminated. Every month, she was reminded that her most fundamental biological processes made her a source of spiritual pollution. Every month, she learned anew that being female meant being periodically cast out from the very community she served so faithfully the rest of the time. Compare this to our modern understanding, where menstruation might be inconvenient or uncomfortable, but where we generally recognize it as a sign of reproductive health, where we have products and medications to manage it, where we can continue our work and relationships largely uninterrupted. We might advocate for menstrual leave policies, for better healthcare coverage, for reduced stigma around discussing women's health. But our advocacy assumes that the basic biological function is normal, natural, nothing to be ashamed of. Biblical women lived in a world where their bodies' natural rhythms were seen as evidence of spiritual corruption, where the very processes that made them capable of bearing children, the highest calling available to women in their society, simultaneously marked them as ritually defiled. The contradiction was crushing. They were valued primarily for their reproductive capacity, yet that same capacity made them periodically unfit for community life. The isolation extended far beyond menstruation. Childbirth, that moment we now celebrate with baby showers and hospital visitors, rendered a biblical woman unclean for weeks. After giving birth to a son, she remained in a state of purification for 40 days. After bearing a daughter, that period doubled to 80 days. The message was unmistakable. Female children carried even more contamination than male children. Female bodies were even more spiritually dangerous than the rest of creation. Picture Miriam years later, holding her newborn daughter for the first time. The joy of new life would be shadowed by the knowledge that this child, simply by being female, had made her mother's purification period twice as long as if she had been a boy had. The baby girl's first gift to the world, according to the religious law that governed their lives, was additional contamination. Today, new mothers might struggle with postpartum depression, with breastfeeding challenges, with the adjustment to parenthood. But these struggles unfold within a framework that celebrates new life, that sees childbirth as natural and beautiful, that provides medical support and social congratulation. We might take paternity photos, announce births on social media, welcome visitors to meet the new baby. The mother might return to work with legally protected pumping breaks, might receive gifts and support from her community. Biblical women experienced the miracle of birth through a lens of contamination and purification. Their bodies, having performed the most godlike act of creation, were treated as spiritually polluted by the very process. They celebrated new life while being told that bringing forth that life had made them unfit for the community of the faithful. Yet even within these crushing restrictions, we see the remarkable adaptability of women finding ways to reclaim their experiences. The periods of purification, isolating as they were, also provided rest from the endless demands of household management. The time away from cooking, cleaning, and serving others might have been the only respite these women ever received. Some scholars suggest that these enforced breaks may have actually protected women's health in a world without modern medical understanding of postpartum recovery. The communities of women that formed during these periods of separation created their own networks of support and wisdom. Mothers taught daughters, sisters comforted sisters, experienced women guided those facing their first childbirth. In the margins of religious law, in the spaces created by their shared contamination, biblical women built relationships and passed down knowledge that sustained them through their constrained lives. But the restrictions on women's bodies extended far beyond biological functions. Their very appearance, their clothing, their visibility in public spaces were governed by laws and customs that would seem suffocating to modern women. Today, we might debate dress codes in schools or workplaces, might advocate for the right to wear what makes us feel comfortable and confident. But these debates assume our basic right to appear in public, to participate in community life, to be seen and heard as full members of society. Biblical women lived under covering requirements that went far beyond modesty. They were about invisibility, about ensuring that women's presence in public spaces was as minimal and unnoticed as possible. A married woman who appeared in public with her hair uncovered could be divorced without receiving her marriage settlement. This wasn't just about religious observance, it was about economic survival. A woman's hair, her most obvious marker of beauty and femininity, became a source of potential destitution if displayed improperly. The covering wasn't just about hair. Voice, gesture, movement, all were regulated to ensure that women passed through public spaces like ghosts, present but unseen, necessary but unremarked upon. They learned to modulate their voices to whispers, to avoid eye contact with men outside their families, to move quickly and quietly from one protected space to another. Compare this to our modern expectation that public spaces belong to all of us equally. Women today serve as news anchors, politicians, performers, teachers. We might still face catcalling or harassment, might still feel unsafe in certain situations, but we don't expect to be invisible. We expect to be seen, heard, recognized as full participants in public life. The economic implications of these physical restrictions were enormous. Today, a woman's ability to earn money might depend on her education, her skills, her networking ability, her willingness to negotiate for better wages. She might face glass ceilings or wage gaps, but she has legal right to work, to own property, to control her own finances. Biblical women's economic survival depended entirely on their relationships with men who could appear in public, who could own property, who could engage in business. Their own skills and intelligence mattered only insofar as they could influence the men who held legal and economic power. A woman might be brilliant at managing resources, skilled at negotiation, wise in her judgments, but these abilities could only be exercised through her husband's authority, her father's permission, her son's protection. The story of the woman of Proverbs 31 illustrates this complex reality. She is praised for her industry, her wisdom, her economic contribution to her household. She buys fields, plants vineyards, engages in commerce, provides for her family and servants. Yet all of this activity takes place within the framework of her husband's authority. Her achievements are celebrated, but they are his achievements too. Her success brings him honor at the city gates, where he sits with the elders and conducts the official business that her behind-the-scenes work makes possible. This woman is held up as an ideal, and indeed, her capabilities are remarkable. But notice what is not said about her. She has no individual identity apart from her family roles. She is not named. Her thoughts, her dreams, her personal aspirations are never mentioned. She is praised for her contributions, but those contributions are valuable only insofar as they serve others. Modern women might recognize some of these dynamics. The invisible labor that keeps households running, the tendency for women's contributions to be overlooked or credited to others. But we also live in a world where we can advocate for recognition, where we can build independent careers, where we can accumulate wealth and property in our own names. The health knowledge available to biblical women was a mixture of folk wisdom, religious interpretation, and dangerous ignorance. Today, we might criticize the medical establishment for not taking women's pain seriously, for conducting research primarily on male subjects, for not understanding women's unique health needs. But these criticisms assume access to medical care, assume that women's bodies are legitimate subjects for scientific study, assume that we have the right to make informed decisions about our own health. Biblical women had access to midwives and wise women who passed down traditional knowledge about herbs, childbirth, and healing. But this knowledge existed alongside beliefs that illness was caused by sin, that suffering was divine punishment, that a woman's pain in childbirth was specifically ordained by God as consequence of Eve's disobedience. Medical treatment was often indistinguishable from spiritual intervention, and both were controlled by male religious authorities who might have little understanding of female physiology. The story of the woman with the issue of blood illustrates the intersection of physical suffering and social isolation that characterize women's health experiences in biblical times. This woman had been bleeding for 12 years, not the normal monthly cycle, but a continuous flow that rendered her permanently unclean. She could not touch another human being without contaminating them. She could not enter the temple, could not participate in religious festivals, could not maintain normal relationships with family and friends. For 12 years, she lived in isolation, her condition marking her as spiritually as well as physically diseased. When she touched Jesus' garment in the crowd, she was breaking religious law by exposing others to her contamination. Yet her desperate faith led to healing, not just physical healing, but restoration to community, to relationship, to the possibility of normal life. Her story resonates across the centuries because it captures the particular vulnerability of women whose bodies betrayed them in a world that offered little understanding and less compassion. Today, a woman with a similar condition might face embarrassment, discomfort, expensive medical treatments. But she would not face complete social ostracism, would not be considered spiritually contaminated, would not be cut off from her community simply because her body was functioning abnormally. The psychological impact of living in a body that was considered inherently contaminating, periodically dangerous, spiritually inferior to male bodies, cannot be overstated. Biblical women learned from infancy that their physical existence was problematic, that their most basic biological functions made them unfit for full participation in community life, that their bodies were sources of shame rather than strength. Yet within this framework of contamination and control, we see remarkable examples of women who found ways to honor their physical existence, to see their bodies as gifts rather than curses, to understand their capacity for creation as reflecting divine image rather than divine punishment. The midwives who defied Pharaoh's order to kill Hebrew male infants saw their role in preserving life as sacred calling. The women who followed Jesus, supporting his ministry with their resources and their presence, transformed their traditional roles as caregivers into radical discipleship. These women lived in bodies that their culture told them were inferior, contaminating, dangerous. Yet they found ways to use those same bodies in service of purposes larger than themselves, to transform cultural restrictions into opportunities for faithfulness, to discover dignity and worth despite messages that suggested they had little of either. As the night deepens around us and we sink further into this ancient world, let the weight of these physical restrictions settle gently around you. Feel the texture of a life lived in a body that was never truly your own, where your most basic biological functions marked you as spiritually dangerous, where your physical presence in the world was carefully regulated and constantly monitored. Yet in that weight, in that constraint, notice also the strength that developed. Like flowers that bloom in harsh climates, biblical women's spirits flourished precisely because they had to work within such physical limitations. They developed forms of resilience, creativity, and faithfulness that transformed their constrained circumstances into opportunities for profound spiritual growth. Their bodies may have been seen as contaminated, but their spirits learned to soar. Their physical presence may have been restricted, but their influence spread in ways that continue to inspire us centuries later. They were told their bodies were inferior, yet they used those same bodies to bring life into the world, to nurture and sustain communities, to serve purposes that outlasted the cultures that constrained them. In the gentle darkness of this ancient evening, let their quiet courage become a blessing, their patient endurance a source of peace. They lived in bodies that were never fully their own, yet they found ways to honor the divine image within them. They were physically constrained, yet spiritually free. They were told they were contaminated, yet they knew themselves to be beloved. In their patient acceptance and their quiet rebellion, in their faithful service and their hidden strength, they whisper across the centuries that human dignity cannot be legislated away, that worth cannot be diminished by unjust laws, that the spirit can flourish even when the body is bound. The shadows lengthen in these ancient homes, and we find ourselves drawn deeper into the most private spaces of biblical women's lives, their marriages, their relationships with their children, their domestic world that was both their kingdom and their prison. Here, in the flickering lamplight of evening, we discover that even love itself was constrained by laws and customs that would seem alien to our modern understanding of partnership and family. In 2025, marriage might begin with dating apps, coffee meetings, long conversations about goals and dreams and compatibility. Couples might live together first, might attend counseling, might negotiate prenuptials and discuss career plans, and decide together whether and when to have children. We expect marriage to be a partnership of equals, a source of emotional fulfillment, a relationship built on mutual choice and sustained by ongoing consent. But biblical marriage was a transaction between families, an economic arrangement sealed by bride price and dowry, a relationship in which love was hoped for but never guaranteed, never required, and certainly never considered sufficient grounds for the union itself. The bride and groom might meet for the first time at their wedding. Their compatibility was less important than their family's alliance. Their personal happiness was secondary to the economic and social benefits their union would bring to their extended networks. Imagine Miriam, now a young woman, learning that her father has accepted an offer for her hand. She might know nothing about her intended husband, beyond his family's reputation and his ability to provide for her. She has no veto power, no opportunity to get to know him, no chance to discover whether they share interests, values, or any basic compatibility. Her feelings about the arrangement are not consulted because they are not considered relevant. The wedding itself would be a community celebration, but it would also be a public transfer of ownership. Miriam would leave her father's house and enter her husband's, taking with her only the possessions her family had negotiated as her dowry. From that moment forward, her legal existence would be subsumed into her husband's identity. She would take his name, serve his household, bear his children, and dedicate her life to his comfort and prosperity. The wedding night, which modern couples might approach with nervous excitement or romantic anticipation, was for biblical women often a moment of fear and pain, with no sex education, no understanding of their own bodies, no expectation that their pleasure or comfort would be considered. They entered into physical intimacy as they entered into marriage itself, as a duty to be endured rather than a joy to be shared. Modern women might struggle with communication in marriage, with balancing career and family, with maintaining individual identity within partnership. But these struggles assume that marriage is meant to be a relationship between two whole people, that both partners' needs and desires matter, that love and respect and mutual fulfillment are reasonable expectations. Biblical women entered marriage with entirely different expectations. They hoped for kindness from their husbands, for children to secure their status, for economic stability and protection from the dangers that threatened unattached women. Love, if it came, was a gift from God, but it was never promised, and its absence was not grounds for complaint. The story of Leah provides a heartbreaking illustration of how marriage without love shaped a woman's entire existence. Tricked into marrying Jacob when he intended to marry her sister Rachel, Leah spent her entire married life knowing she was second choice, knowing that every time Jacob looked at her, he was reminded of deception, knowing that her presence in his bed was an obligation rather than a desire. She bore him 6 sons and a daughter, hoping with each birth that finally she would earn his affection. She named her children with increasingly desperate hope. Reuben, because the Lord has looked upon my misery. Now my husband will love me. Simeon, because the Lord heard that I was unloved. Levi, now my husband will be attached to me. With each child, she told herself that surely this time she would win what she had never been given, her husband's heart. But Jacob continued to love Rachel, continued to prefer her sister's company, continued to make clear through his actions and attention that Leah was the wife he had been forced to accept rather than the woman he had chosen to cherish. Leah lived her entire adult life in a marriage where she was tolerated but not wanted, where her contributions were acknowledged but not appreciated, where she was the mother of his children but never the love of his life. Modern readers might ask why Leah didn't leave, why she didn't demand better treatment, why she continued to bear children for a man who clearly didn't love her. But these questions reveal how completely our modern perspective shapes our understanding. Leah had nowhere to go. Divorce, if available at all, would have meant economic destitution and social disgrace. Her children were her only security, her only claim to significance in her husband's household. Bearing sons was not just about earning love, it was about survival. Yet within this loveless marriage, Leah found ways to create meaning. She became the mother of Judah, from whose line King David and ultimately Jesus would come. She found purpose in her role as matriarch, strength in her faithfulness to duties that brought her no personal joy. Her story reminds us that resilience can flourish even in the most emotionally barren circumstances, that women can find significance even when they are not valued for themselves. The relationship between mothers and children in biblical times was shaped by the same constraints that governed everything else in women's lives. Today, we might debate helicopter parenting versus free-range kids, might worry about screen time and college admissions and our children's emotional well-being. We expect to be involved in our children's education, their healthcare, their major life decisions. We see parenting as a partnership with our spouses, as a role that requires balance with our other identities and responsibilities. But biblical motherhood was defined by different priorities entirely. A woman's primary obligation was to produce children, especially sons, who would carry on the family line and provide for her in old age. Her relationship with her children was shaped by their gender, their birth order, their potential value to the family's economic and social standing. Sons were treasured because they would inherit property, carry on the family name, and provide security for aging parents. Daughters were loved but also understood to be temporary members of the household. They would marry and leave, taking their dowries with them, becoming members of other families. A mother's relationship with her daughters was necessarily shaped by the knowledge that these children would soon belong to other households, other priorities, other loyalties. The story of Hannah illustrates the desperate importance of motherhood in biblical women's lives. Unable to conceive, she was tormented not just by her own longing for a child, but by her rival wife Peninnah, who had borne children and never let Hannah forget her failure. Hannah's barrenness affected not just her personal happiness, but her standing in the household, her relationship with her husband, her sense of worth and purpose. When Hannah finally conceived and bore Samuel, she kept her vow to dedicate him to temple service. But notice the cost. She gave up her long-awaited child, surrendered the son she had prayed for so desperately, because her obligation to God superseded even her maternal desires. Modern mothers might make sacrifices for their children's benefit, might send them away to school or support their career choices that take them far from home. But the idea of giving up a child entirely, of surrendering parental rights and relationship for religious purposes, would be almost unthinkable to us. Hannah's story reveals the complex intersection of personal desire and religious duty that shaped biblical motherhood. Women were expected to want children desperately, to see motherhood as their highest calling, to find their primary identity in their roles as mothers. Yet they were also expected to surrender those children to higher purposes when required, to subordinate their maternal instincts to religious obligations, to accept that even their most precious relationships were not truly their own. The daily realities of raising children in biblical times were shaped by high infant mortality rates, by the constant threat of disease and famine, by the understanding that many children would not survive to adulthood. Modern parents might worry about their children's safety. might take elaborate precautions to protect them from harm. But we generally expect our children to survive, to grow up, to have opportunities we can help them pursue. Biblical mothers lived with the constant awareness that the children they nursed and loved and taught might be taken from them at any moment. They had to invest deeply in relationships that were always fragile, had to pour their love into children who might not live to return that love as adults. This awareness shaped their approach to parenting, creating a mixture of fierce protectiveness and emotional reserve that helped them survive losses we can barely imagine. Yet within these constraints, biblical mothers found ways to shape their children's characters, to pass down values and traditions, to prepare them for the realities they would face. They taught daughters the skills of household management, the arts of diplomacy and influence that women needed to survive in a male-dominated world. They instructed sons in practical wisdom, in understanding of human nature, in the fear of the Lord that would guide them through life's challenges. The Proverbs attributed to King Lemuel's mother provide a glimpse into this maternal instruction. She warned her son against the dangers that could destroy a king: wine, women, and the abuse of power. She taught him to speak for those who could not speak for themselves, to defend the rights of the poor and needy. Her words reveal a mother who understood political realities, who had observed human nature carefully, who used her influence over her son to promote justice and wisdom in his rule. This kind of behind-the-scenes influence was one of the few forms of power available to biblical women. They could not rule directly, but they could shape the men who would rule. They could not make laws, but they could influence the moral character of those who would. They could not speak publicly, but they could whisper wisdom in private moments that would echo in public decisions for generations. The domestic sphere that was women's primary domain was both limiting and significant. Today, we might struggle with the division of household labor, might negotiate who does the cooking and cleaning and childcare. We might hire help, use convenience foods, outsource various domestic responsibilities. We see household management as one responsibility among many, important, but not all-consuming. But for biblical women, the household was their kingdom, their area of expertise and authority, their primary contribution to family welfare and social stability. They were responsible not just for cooking and cleaning, but for food preservation, textile production, healthcare, education of young children, management of servants, hospitality to guests, and countless other tasks that kept their families alive and thriving. The woman described in Proverbs 31 illustrates the complexity and importance of this domestic role. She rises before dawn to provide food for her household. She considers fields and buys them. She plants vineyards with her own hands. She makes linen garments and sells them. She extends her hand to the poor and reaches out to the needy. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. This is not the picture of a woman confined to simple housekeeping. This is a portrait of an economic manager, a business owner, a community leader who operates within the domestic sphere, but whose influence extends far beyond her own household. Her husband is respected at the city gates because of her contributions to his prosperity. Her children call her blessed because of her wise management of family resources. Yet notice that all of her achievements are still defined in relationship to others. She is praised for bringing honor to her husband, for providing for her children, for extending help to the needy. Her success is measured not by her own fulfillment, but by how well she serves others. She has no independent identity, no personal goals that don't relate to family welfare, no achievements that are valued for their own sake, rather than for their contribution to others' well-being. This pattern of finding significance through service to others shaped every aspect of biblical women's lives. They were not expected to have personal ambitions, individual dreams, or independent goals. Their fulfillment was supposed to come entirely through the success and happiness of their families. They were to find their identity in their relationships, daughter of, wife of, mother of, rather than in their own achievements or characteristics. The psychological pressure of this expectation was enormous. Imagine being responsible for everyone else's happiness while having no right to pursue your own. Imagine being expected to find complete satisfaction in roles you never chose, in relationships that were arranged for you, in circumstances you had no power to change. Yet even within these crushing expectations, we see glimpses of women who managed to maintain their individuality, who found ways to be themselves despite everything that sought to erase their personal identity. They developed inner lives rich with faith and wisdom. They created networks of friendship and support with other women. They found ways to influence outcomes through their deep understanding of the men who held official power over them. As the night settles more deeply around these ancient households, we can almost hear the soft sounds of daily life. Children's laughter, women's voices in quiet conversation, the gentle rhythms of domestic tasks that kept these families functioning. The world was small, bounded by household walls and family obligations. But within those boundaries, love grew, wisdom flourished, and human dignity persisted despite everything that sought to diminish it. The constraints were real, the limitations crushing, the expectations overwhelming. Yet, in the gentle flicker of oil lamps, in the quiet moments between endless tasks, biblical women found ways to create meaning, to nurture hope, to pass down to their daughters not just the skills of survival but the deeper wisdom of endurance, faith, and the quiet knowledge that even the smallest acts of love could echo through eternity. Their marriages may have been transactions, but within them, affection sometimes bloomed. Their motherhood may have been duty, but through it, they shaped the character of nations. Their domestic work may have been invisible, but it was the foundation upon which civilization itself rested. They lived constrained lives, but they lived them with a dignity and strength that still inspires us across the millennia. In the deepening quiet of this ancient night, we find ourselves drawn to perhaps the most profound difference between biblical women and women of today. Their relationship with the divine, their understanding of their place in God's plan, their struggle to find meaning and purpose within religious structures that seem designed to exclude them from full participation in spiritual life. Today, women serve as ministers, rabbis, priests, and spiritual leaders across many traditions. We might still encounter resistance in some religious contexts, might still fight for full equality in certain denominations, but the basic principle that women can have direct, unmediated relationships with God is widely accepted. We read scripture for ourselves, pray in our own words, seek divine guidance for our personal decisions, understand ourselves as beloved children of God, with our own unique callings and purposes. But biblical women lived within religious systems where their access to the sacred was carefully controlled and mediated through male authority. They could not serve as priests, could not offer sacrifices in the temple, could not study Torah formally with religious teachers, could not participate fully in many of the rituals that defined their community's relationship with God. Their spiritual lives were largely private affairs, expressed through personal prayer, household observances, and the informal religious instruction they gave their children. Yet within these limitations, many biblical women developed profound spiritual depth and found ways to experience the divine that transcended the structures meant to contain them. Consider Hannah, whose desperate prayer for a child became a model of faithful petition that echoed through generations. Standing in the temple, her lips moving silently as she poured out her heart to God, she was so absorbed in prayer that the priest Eli thought she was drunk. Hannah's prayer reveals something remarkable about biblical women's spirituality. Unable to offer formal sacrifices, excluded from the official priesthood, she nonetheless approached God with a directness and intimacy that transcended religious hierarchy. She made her own vow, promised her own sacrifice, negotiated directly with the divine without requiring male mediation. Her prayer was so powerful, so authentic, that when God answered it, the child she bore became one of Israel's greatest prophets. This pattern repeats throughout biblical narratives. Women finding ways to connect with God despite religious structures, that seemed designed to keep them at a distance. Miriam led the women of Israel in celebration after crossing the Red Sea, her tambourine and voice lifting the community in praise that complemented her brother Moses' formal leadership. The prophetess Deborah held court under her palm tree, dispensing divine wisdom and justice to all who sought it, leading Israel into battle when no man would step forward. These women didn't challenge the religious system directly. Such challenge would have been not only futile but dangerous. Instead, they found ways to work within it, to discover cracks in the walls of exclusion where divine light could shine through. They became prophets when prophecy was one of the few spiritual roles available to women. They influenced through their careful positioning within families whose men held religious authority. They discovered that God's voice could speak through female lips, even when human authorities preferred those lips to remain silent. But for most biblical women, spiritual life was not about public prophecy or religious leadership. It was about the daily practice of faith within the constraints of domestic life, about finding God in the grinding of grain, the bearing of children, the tending of households. Their prayer was not the formal recitation of liturgy, but the whispered conversations with the divine that sustained them through endless days of service to others. These women developed what we might call domestic spirituality, the understanding that God could be encountered in the most ordinary moments of daily life, that holiness could be found in the fulfillment of even the most mundane duties. That service to family was itself a form of worship. They sanctified their constrained existence by seeing it as sacred calling, transformed their limitations into opportunities for devotion. The unnamed woman who anointed Jesus with expensive perfume understood this kind of spirituality. While the disciples grumbled about the waste of money, Jesus recognized her action as prophetic, as preparation for his burial, as worship. That transcended the official categories of religious observance. She had no formal authority, no priestly credentials, no scholarly training, but she had love, she had intuition, and she had the courage to act on her spiritual understanding even when others questioned her actions. This woman's story illustrates the particular challenges biblical women faced in expressing their faith. Their spiritual insights were often dismissed or misunderstood by the men around them. Their acts of devotion were criticized as wasteful or inappropriate. Their direct approaches to the divine were filtered through male interpretation and judgment. Yet they persisted, finding ways to honor God despite the obstacles placed in their path. The restrictions on women's religious participation weren't just about formal roles. They shaped the very way biblical women understood themselves in relationship to the divine. Today, we might struggle with theological questions about God's will for our lives, about how to balance faith with personal ambition, about what it means to follow divine calling in a complex world. But our struggles assume that we have legitimate spiritual agency, that our relationship with God is our own to nurture and develop. Biblical women lived within theological frameworks that taught them their spiritual value was secondary to men's, that their access to God was properly mediated through male authority, that their highest spiritual calling was submission to the men God had placed over them. They were taught that their natural inclination toward independence was evidence of the fallen nature inherited from Eve, that their desires for autonomy were spiritually dangerous, that their fulfillment lay in perfect obedience to earthly authorities who represented divine will. Yet even within these crushing theological constraints, we see flashes of women who understood their relationship with God differently, who experienced divine love and calling in ways that transcended human limitations. The Syrophoenician woman who argued with Jesus about healing her daughter demonstrated a theological sophistication and spiritual boldness that impressed even the Son of God. She didn't accept his initial refusal, didn't defer to his authority as a religious teacher. didn't allow social conventions about women's proper silence to prevent her from advocating for her child. Mary Magdalene, who stood at the foot of the cross when the male disciples had fled, who came to the tomb while it was still dark, who became the first witness to the resurrection, embodied a kind of faithful courage that transcended gender roles and religious expectations. Her love for Jesus was so deep, so authentic, that it led her to places and actions that defied conventional wisdom about women's proper place in religious life. But perhaps the most remarkable example of biblical women's complex relationship with faith is found in Mary, the mother of Jesus. Here was a young woman, probably still a teenager, who received perhaps the most extraordinary divine calling in human history. Yet her response, "Let it be unto me according to your word," was shaped by the very submission that her culture demanded of women. Modern readers sometimes struggle with Mary's acquiescence, wondering why she didn't ask more questions, demand more explanation, negotiate better terms for this life-altering responsibility. But Mary's acceptance wasn't passive resignation. It was active faith exercised within the constraints of her world. She couldn't refuse God's calling, not because she lacked agency, but because her entire understanding of purpose and meaning was built around service to divine will. Her song of praise, the Magnificat, reveals the depth of her spiritual understanding. She spoke of God lifting up the lowly, bringing down the mighty, filling the hungry with good things. This wasn't the prayer of a submissive victim, but of a woman who understood that God's ways often invert human power structures, that divine purposes are accomplished through those the world considers weak and insignificant. Mary's faith was revolutionary precisely because it was expressed through submission. In a world that told women their highest calling was obedience to male authority, she demonstrated obedience to divine authority that transcended human hierarchies. Her willingness to bear the Christ child was an act of spiritual courage that required her to risk social disgrace, family rejection, even death by stoning according to the laws governing adultery and premarital pregnancy. The women who followed Jesus during his ministry found ways to support his work within the constraints of their cultural roles. They couldn't be formal disciples in the way the 12 men were, couldn't travel openly as religious teachers, couldn't preach in synagogues, or hold religious office. But they provided financial support, offered hospitality, created the networks of care and provision that made Jesus' ministry possible. Luke tells us that women like Joanna, the wife of Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others, supported Jesus' ministry out of their own resources. These weren't poor, powerless women, but women of means who found ways to use their economic influence to further God's purposes. They understood that their wealth, their social connections, their domestic skills could all be instruments of divine will. Their support wasn't just financial, it was relational, emotional, spiritual. They created communities of faith that sustained not just Jesus, but each other. In a world where women's friendships were often seen as opportunities for gossip or mischief, these women forged bonds of spiritual purpose that transcended conventional expectations about female relationships. The early church struggled with how to incorporate women's obvious spiritual gifts within existing religious structures. Paul's letters reveal the tension. He acknowledged women as co-workers in the gospel, praised female leaders like Priscilla and Phoebe, recognized women's prophetic gifts. Yet he also instructed women to remain silent in churches, to submit to their husbands, to find their spiritual identity through their relationships to men. This contradiction wasn't just about Paul's personal views. It reflected the broader challenge of expressing new spiritual realities within old cultural forms. The gospel proclaimed that in Christ there was neither male nor female, that all were one in God's love. But that spiritual equality had to be lived out within societies that were built on gender hierarchy, within religious traditions that assumed male spiritual authority within families and communities that depended on women's submission for social stability. Biblical women navigated this tension with remarkable creativity and faithfulness. They found ways to exercise spiritual gifts within acceptable boundaries, to influence religious life through informal networks, to pass down faith traditions through their role as mothers and teachers of children. They became the backbone of early Christian communities not through formal leadership, but through the steady faithfulness that sustained religious life from generation to generation. The martyrdom of women in the early church reveals another dimension of their spiritual courage. Women like Perpetua, who faced death in the arena rather than renounce her faith, demonstrated that their commitment to Christ transcended even their culturally mandated roles as wives and mothers. Perpetua's prison diary reveals a woman whose relationship with God was so direct, so personal, so unmediated by human authority that she could face death with peace and even joy. These martyrs didn't die for the right to preach or lead churches. They died for the right to believe, to worship, to maintain their spiritual identity even when it conflicted with family expectations and social pressures. Their courage wasn't expressed through rebellion against gender roles, but through faithfulness that was so complete it could not be contained by any human structure, including the roles that defined their earthly lives. As we settle deeper into this ancient world of faith and constraint, imagine the quiet courage it took for biblical women to maintain their spiritual lives within systems designed to limit them. Picture them rising before dawn, not just to prepare meals, but to pray in the silence before household duties claimed their attention. See them finding moments of divine connection in the rhythm of daily tasks, in the nursing of children, in the tending of gardens, in the preparation of meals that nourished both body and soul. Their prayers weren't recorded in formal liturgies. Their theological insights weren't preserved in scholarly treatises. Their spiritual leadership wasn't acknowledged in official histories. Yet their faith was the foundation on which religious communities were built. Their quiet devotion, the bedrock on which more visible forms of religious expression rested. They passed down stories to their children, taught songs of faith through generations, created traditions of hospitality and care that embodied divine love in practical ways. They were the keepers of religious memory, the preservers of sacred tradition, the transmitters of spiritual wisdom from one generation to the next. Their spirituality was incarnational in the deepest sense. They found God not in escape from their earthly constraints, but in the faithful living of their limited lives. They discovered that holiness could flourish in the narrowest spaces, that divine purposes could be accomplished through the most ordinary actions, that even the smallest acts of faithfulness could echo through eternity. In the gentle darkness of this ancient evening, let their quiet faith become a blessing, their patient endurance a source of strength. They lived within religious structures that questioned their spiritual authority, yet they knew themselves to be beloved of God. They were excluded from formal religious leadership, yet they shaped the faith of nations through their influence on the children they raised and the communities they served. Their legacy whispers across the centuries that true spirituality cannot be contained by human structures, that divine love finds ways to flow even through the narrowest channels, that God's purposes are often accomplished through those the world considers least likely to matter. They were told their voices didn't belong in formal worship, yet their prayers still echo. They were excluded from official religious roles, yet their faith still inspires. They were constrained by earthly limitations, yet their spirits soared free, touching the divine in ways that transform not just their own lives but the world around them. The oil lamps burn lower now, casting dancing shadows on walls that have witnessed countless such scenes of quiet devotion, of faith maintained despite obstacles, of love for God expressed through faithful service to others. Their world was small, their voices often silenced, their spiritual gifts frequently unrecognized. Yet in the depths of their constrained lives, they discovered truths about divine love, human dignity, and spiritual purpose that continue to illuminate the path for all who seek to live faithfully within whatever limitations they face. Tonight, as we draw near to the end of our journey through this ancient world, let us pause at one final threshold. We've walked together through dusty streets and lamplight rooms, through the constraints and quiet courage of women whose lives were measured not by their own dreams, but by their faithfulness to roles they never chose. Now, in these last quiet moments, let's consider what their stories mean for us here in 2025, as we drift towards sleep with their whispers still echoing in our minds. It's tempting, from our modern vantage point, to look back at biblical women with pity, to see their lives as nothing but a catalogue of restrictions and lost opportunities. We might shake our heads at Sarah's silence when Abraham claimed she was his sister, at Leah's desperate attempts to win love that would never come, at the countless unnamed women who lived and died within boundaries we can barely comprehend. We might wonder how they endured such limitations, how they found meaning in such constrained existence, how they maintained dignity when their very personhood was subsumed into others' identities. But as we've walked through their world together, something else has emerged from the shadows of those ancient homes. In the space between what was permitted and what was possible, biblical women discovered forms of strength that our more liberated age might struggle to understand. They learned to read the unspoken language of power, to influence through indirection, to find ways to matter even when their mattering was not officially recognized. Consider how different our modern struggles are from theirs. Today, we might agonize over work-life balance, over whether to lean in or opt out, over how to have it all in a world that offers us unprecedented choices. We debate glass ceilings and wage gaps, fight for reproductive rights and equal representation, demand recognition for our contributions and agency over our own lives. These are worthy battles, necessary struggles that build on the foundation of freedoms our ancestors could never have imagined. But sometimes, in our abundance of choices, we lose sight of something biblical women understood instinctively, that meaning doesn't require perfect freedom, that influence doesn't demand official authority, that love can flourish even in the hardest ground. They found ways to matter within systems that seemed designed to make them invisible. They exercised power from positions of apparent powerlessness. They shaped history through their faithful attention to daily tasks that seemed insignificant, but were, in truth, the very foundation on which civilization rested. Their stories remind us that human dignity is not granted by laws or customs, but arises from something deeper, something that can't be legislated away or diminished by unjust restrictions. Sarah may have been passed off as her husband's sister, but she was still the mother of nations. Leah may have been unloved by her husband, but she became the matriarch of tribes that would echo through eternity. Ruth may have been a foreign widow with no legal standing, but her loyalty and wisdom secured her a place in the lineage of kings. These women didn't overcome their circumstances through rebellion or revolution, though we see flashes of both in their stories. They transcended their limitations through a kind of patient faithfulness that transformed constraint into opportunity, that found light in the darkest corners, that made holy the most ordinary moments of domestic life. As we live in our world of expanded possibilities, we might ask ourselves, what can we learn from women who found ways to flourish within boundaries we would find suffocating? How did they maintain hope when their futures were determined by others? What gave them strength to love deeply when that love might not be returned? To serve faithfully when that service might not be acknowledged? To keep going when they had no guarantee that their sacrifices would matter to anyone beyond their immediate household? Perhaps the answer lies in their understanding that significance is not measured by the size of one's stage, but by the depth of one's faithfulness to whatever role life presents. Biblical women didn't choose their circumstances, but they chose how to respond to them. They couldn't control their destinies, but they could control their character. They had no power over the systems that constrained them, but they had power over the spirit they brought to their constrained existence. Their legacy whispers to us across the centuries that resilience is not about breaking free from all limitations, but about finding ways to be fully human within whatever limitations we face. That influence is not always about commanding, but sometimes about inspiring. That love is not always about being chosen, but sometimes about choosing to love, regardless of whether that love is returned. In our modern world, with its emphasis on individual achievement and personal fulfillment, we might miss the profound wisdom embedded in their stories. They understood something we sometimes forget, that the most important victories are often invisible, that the most lasting influence is often indirect, that the most meaningful lives are often lived in service to purposes larger than personal ambition. This doesn't mean we should romanticize their suffering or accept injustice as inevitable. The freedoms we enjoy today, our right to education, to economic independence, to political participation, to bodily autonomy, these are precious gifts that honor the struggles of women throughout history who endured constraints so that future generations might know greater liberty. But neither should we dismiss their wisdom as the consolation prize of oppression. Biblical women discovered truths about human nature, divine purpose, and the sources of true strength that remain relevant regardless of our external circumstances. They learned that dignity comes from within, that influence flows from character, that the ability to shape others' lives through faithful love is itself a form of power that transcends political structures and social hierarchies. Their stories teach us that every life, no matter how constrained, contains possibilities for meaning that go beyond the boundaries others might place around it. That even when we cannot choose our circumstances, we can choose our response to them. That sometimes the most radical act is not rebellion, but the quiet persistence of hope, love, and faithfulness in the face of overwhelming obstacles. As you settle into sleep tonight, let their voices become a gentle lullaby. Let Sarah's laughter at God's impossible promises remind you that joy can surprise us even in our darkest moments. Let Rebecca's initiative at the well inspire you to acts of kindness that might change the course of history in ways you'll never know. Let Ruth's loyalty speak to the power of choosing love over security, of commitment over convenience. Let Esther's courage in approaching the king uninvited remind you that sometimes the most important words are spoken when speaking carries the highest cost. Let Mary's yes to the angel echo in your heart as an example of faith that trusts divine purposes, even when those purposes lead through paths we cannot understand. These women lived in a world so different from ours that it might as well have been another planet. Yet, in their humanity, in their longing for meaning and connection, in their quiet acts of love and their moments of faith, they are recognizably us. Across the vast differences in law and custom and possibility, we recognize in them the same hopes and fears, the same capacity for resilience and love, the same stubborn insistence on dignity that drives us today. The restrictions that shape their lives may seem harsh to us, even cruel, but they were also the framework within which some of history's most enduring stories of faith and courage unfolded. These women found ways to be fully human within inhuman systems, to love deeply despite loveless circumstances, to hope persistently when hope seemed foolish, to trust in divine purposes when human authorities failed them. Their quiet strength echoes across the millennia, reminding us that true power is not always loud, that lasting influence is not always visible, that the most important battles are sometimes won not through confrontation, but through the patient persistence of those who refuse to let their spirits be crushed by their circumstances. The night is deep now, and their stories settle around us like a soft blanket. Biblical women lived constrained lives, but they lived them with a grace and strength that still inspires. They were told their voices didn't matter, yet their whispers still carry across the centuries. They were excluded from the halls of power, yet they shaped the character of nations through the children they raised and the communities they served. Their legacy lives not in monuments of stone, but in the quiet revolution they sparked simply by refusing to let their humanity be diminished by the systems that sought to contain them. They were physically bound by laws we would find intolerable, yet their spirits learned to soar in ways that transformed not just their own lives, but the very foundations of faith and family that still sustain us today. In this gentle darkness, let their patience become your peace, their endurance your comfort, their faith your foundation. They walked paths we will never have to walk, carried burdens we will never have to bear, yet they did so with a dignity that reminds us what it truly means to be human. They were daughters and wives and mothers, yes, but they were also something more. They were the keepers of hope in hopeless times, the guardians of love in loveless circumstances, the preservers of divine spark in a world that often seemed determined to extinguish it. Their stories are not just historical curiosities, but living reminders that the human spirit cannot be legislated away, that dignity cannot be diminished by unjust laws, that love finds a way to flourish even in the hardest ground. They lived within constraints we can barely imagine, yet they discovered freedoms we sometimes take for granted, the freedom to choose kindness over bitterness, hope over despair, faith over fear. As we close this journey together, let their whispered prayers become your lullaby, their quiet courage your comfort, their patient love your blessing. They were told they were less, yet they knew they were beloved. They were silenced, yet they spoke through their actions. They were constrained, yet their influence spread like ripples across the waters of history, reaching even to us here in our modern world, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful legacy is not what we take, but what we give, not what we achieve, but how we endure, not what we demand, but how we love. The oil lamps burn low now in those ancient homes, casting their final shadows on walls that witnessed so much quiet heroism. These women are at rest now, their struggles ended, their constrained lives transformed into eternal significance. They sleep in the arms of the God who saw their tears, who heard their silent prayers, who honored their faithful service even when the world around them failed to recognize their worth. And in that same divine embrace, you too can rest tonight, knowing that their stories live on, their courage continues to inspire, their love still echoes through time. Sleep now, dear friend, with the peace of those who understand that true strength is often quiet, that lasting influence is often invisible, that the most important victories are sometimes won, not in the bright light of public recognition, but in the gentle glow of faithful hearts that refuse to be diminished by the darkness around them. Rest well tonight, knowing that the thread connecting you to these ancient women remains unbroken. In your freedom to choose, remember their wisdom of choosing well within whatever circumstances life presents. In your ability to speak, honor their legacy of finding voice even in silence. In your power to love openly, carry forward their understanding that love itself is the most revolutionary act of all. Their world has passed away, those dust-covered streets and oil lamp shadows dissolved into memory. But their truth remains, that human dignity is not something granted by institutions or guaranteed by laws, but something that rises from within, something that can flourish even in the narrowest spaces, something that transforms even the most constrained existence into a testimony of grace. The biblical women we've met tonight, Sarah learning to laugh at impossible promises, Rebecca showing kindness to strangers, Ruth choosing loyalty over security, Esther risking everything for her people, Mary saying yes to the unthinkable. They were not extraordinary because they lived without limits. They were extraordinary because they discovered how to be fully themselves within the limits they faced. And perhaps that's the most profound gift their stories offer us. Not envy for our modern freedoms, though we should treasure those freedoms deeply. Not judgment of their constrained world, though we should work to ensure such constraints never return. But rather, a deeper understanding of what it means to be human, to find meaning in whatever circumstances we're given, to exercise whatever power we possess with wisdom and compassion, to love as completely as we can within whatever boundaries surround us. Their lives were measured by different metrics than ours, not by personal achievement, but by faithful service, not by individual recognition, but by family legacy, not by freedom to choose, but by wisdom in response. Yet in their faithfulness to roles they never selected, they became the foundation upon which future generations would build greater freedom. In their quiet endurance, they preserved not just their own dignity, but the very possibility that their daughters' daughters might one day know a different world. As sleep draws near, let the rhythm of their ancient days become your lullaby, the sound of grain being ground in darkness, the whisper of prayers offered before dawn, the gentle rustle of robes as mothers tended children, the soft closing of doors that protected what was precious. These sounds have faded now, but their echo remains in every act of selfless love, every moment of patient endurance, every choice to hope when hope seems foolish. The strictness that governed their lives was real, the limitations crushing, the expectations overwhelming. Yet they transformed even these constraints into something beautiful, not because the constraints themselves were good, but because human love and divine grace have the power to find light in the deepest darkness, to create meaning in the most difficult circumstances, to plant seeds of hope in the hardest ground. Tonight, as you rest in your freedom, remember their faithfulness. As you plan your tomorrow with choices they could never imagine, honor their memory by choosing well. As you speak your truth in ways they never could, let their wisdom guide your words. They were our mothers in faith, our teachers in endurance, our guides in the art of finding significance within whatever story life writes for us. The night is complete now, their stories told, their legacy entrusted to your keeping. Sleep comes gently, bringing dreams perhaps of dusty roads and desert stars, of oil lamps flickering against ancient walls, of women who walked before us through far harder paths yet somehow paved the way for the freedoms we now call our own. In their honor, in their memory, and in the quiet strength they've left behind, rest well.